I think I'm going home. I think I want to run around that green ball. That's all. Okay, good morning, everybody. We got about halfway through the material. I left off, we talked about the last bit, although there's one more little tidbit. The 4 different types of hypersensitivity reactions. The 4th type is a cell-mediated response where we think about things like contact dermatitis, poison ivy, and other things like that that stimulate these reactions. And it takes a little more time when we think about these reactions, these type 4, take a day or so to really start seeing the effects. And it's also like an allergic reaction where it requires initial sensitization, and then the second exposure gives you the actual ill effects. So poison ivy and other things are some potentials, but we also think about something like TB testing as we try to detect potential exposure or infection with individuals. We can do a similar sort of test, skin test, that provides a similar sort of reaction like the previous image with the welted up arm on that individual. So this takes a couple of days. So 48 to 72 hours is how long you're supposed to give it. And if you see some red and welting at the result of the site where they've injected it, then you know you've at least been exposed. Doesn't necessarily mean that you are currently infected. Individuals that have been vaccinated against tuberculosis would also show a positive reaction, but in the United States, that's relatively minimal. We think about some military maybe having some of the vaccinations, but for the most part, other people probably not, unless you're not born in the US. So there are all sorts of different situations where you may find yourself maybe putting yourself at risk of developing some sort of hypersensitivity, allergic reaction, and maybe not even really recognize that you're putting yourself in those potential situations. So these pneumonitis, these hypersensitivity pneumonitis, these are different situations where specific occupational exposure, typically over the course of time, sets the stage for you to maybe develop something. So we've got some chickens over here and just humongous room full of cheese. This is so impressive to me. I'm like, oh my gosh, look at that. All right. Not that, you know, I don't find chicken tasty, but I'd rather a nice cheese wheel, right? You've got to pick, right? So really depends. Dust, mold, allergens, all sorts of different things. There are potentials when we might think about working with animals, maybe animals in research or veterinarian situations where you're working with animals, and pet dander, or maybe urine, which can also be a pretty good allergen. Coming in contact with this stuff may ultimately set the stage for some issues. So maybe vet techs whose jobs are to clean out the cages where the cats or the dogs are boarded or staying while they're at the clinic, potentially over the course of, working there for, maybe a handful of years, sets the stage for something like this, where you develop some hypersensitivities. All sorts of different situations that may set the stage for some of that. So to quickly recap those that we have looked at, and then we're going to transition and start thinking about some other stuff. The 4 different types laid out pretty nicely in this table for the specifics that are participating in this. Our type 1 we mentioned were these allergic reactions, and we'll think of IgE as the immunoglobulin that is super important when we think about allergic reactions. All right. So these antigens in this case would be some soluble antigens, something that is readily available within the circulation, dissolving within that, soluble, that gives access to these IgE molecules and the potential to stimulate these immune reactions. As we link up with mast cells and degranulate, we start seeing these ill effects. So can be local or systemic, dependent upon the specifics with the allergen or the severity of the reaction. So from stuff like hay fevers to other food or drug allergies as potentials with that. The type 2, when we talked about these guys, it was blood transfusion or hemolytic disease of the newborn. Antigens on the surface of these types of cells are what we're thinking about. And it's IgG and IgM that are the participating immunoglobulins. And we're looking for not soluble stuff, but those red blood cells exhibiting these specific antigens that we may recognize as being different. All right. So causes all sorts of potential issues with that. Type 3, also IgG and IgM. But like type 1, it's a soluble antigen that we're looking at with this. And these are the result of other previous infections where we have antigens against whatever it might be. We've linked up with antibodies, and these things wind up kind of targeting or getting stuck on different cells, and that stimulates complement activity and the destruction of those respective cells. So it's immune complex disorders or reactions, and complement gets in there and causes issues. So post-streptococcal problems like glomerulonephritis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, we'll see an image with some of that in a minute. It's another where we think of as an immune complex situation. The type 4, we just saw that right as we started with the contact dermatitis. T cells are those participating in this, and it depends really on what we're looking at. It may be soluble or bound antigen with that. And so we could see contact dermatitis in these type 4 reactions. Type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis also fit within this category as a cell-mediated type of response. Really kind of just depends as far as those hypersensitivity reactions, the types of immune cells that participate, lots antibodies, but T cells also important mediators in that. So I've never had allergy testing performed on me, but I think oftentimes it's usually on the person's back where they do the allergy testing. You're shaking your head. Yes. Have you had allergy testing?
No, but my roommates.
Your roommates have, and it's on their back, right? So I don't really know what's up with this because it looks like we're looking at the forearm of this individual. You don't have a huge amount of surface area. And I also feel like that's sort of some sensitive areas to have a bunch of little injections and potential welting to occur. Not that your back isn't a sensitive spot either, but I think maybe you'd be a little happier having all of this performed on your back. I don't know. All right. So seeing this makes me kind of look and think, this person's kind of served as a pincushion We've had all sorts of little bits inoculated into us, and each number here showing where we have made our injection and representing different substances. So we can test a boatload of different things simultaneously. And maybe we find ourselves reacting to numerous things, or maybe nothing. Really depends on your circumstances. So we could see where the inoculations have occurred, and then these wheel and flare reactions. So the redness and welting that results as a positive reaction with this, all right? And so we're looking for type 1 reactions as we're doing this type of allergy testing. Little bit different when we think about the skin testing we would do if we're thinking tuberculosis, but it's a similar sort of appearance if you were to show up as a positive with TB, all right? This is more rapid when we think these type 1 hypersensitivities, not something that's going to require 3 days to welt up, all right? And pretty sure I mentioned last time, there are some potentials with things like seasonal allergies. If you were to be eating honey that was collected locally, it's potential that those pollen grains that you're maybe allergic to could be something that those bees had tapped into some of that pollen or some of that nectar, but got some of that pollen on them. And you can desensitize yourself by eating a little bit of that honey from a local market that's giving you that type of stuff, all right? If you're just buying it from the grocery store, maybe that's coming from someplace completely different with something that you don't really have allergies against. So local gives you maybe a better opportunity. So I'm going to hold on there, Zoomers. I'm going to stop this share and I want to go to a new share. I'm going to jump back to that in 1 second. But as we shift over to the autoimmune diseases, I feel like this table really ought to be in the PowerPoint, but it's not. And, you know, a lot of the figures I have gone in and I have taken from the text and put into the PowerPoints because they seem to be a little clearer in the text than they are on some of that. But trying to snag some of these tables without completely just recreating it from scratch, I can't do it. And I don't really know why I can't, you know, cut and paste this stuff. That's okay, all right? Deep down, there's probably just a button I'm not clicking, and that's what's making it not work. So this table, we're gonna see a good smattering of these diseases, but a few of them not. And I know they're mentioned in the text, but not really giving you visuals of all of them. And as I opened this up this morning, I was like, I know there's got to be a table that does it a little bit better. So I want to jump to this just to quickly see some of it. And then I will move back to my show and tell and give you some pictures of this. I guess I can just scroll down and show you, but whatever. So the first one we were looking at was a hyperthyroidism. It's down here in a second, but Addison's disease, maybe we're doing alphabetical over here. As I'm looking at this, I'm like, that seems to fit. Addison's disease, we see issues with your adrenal gland. These are all autoimmune, different types of autoimmunity that we may see, all right? So cytotoxic T cells start destroying adrenal gland cells, and we see all sorts of issues with this: weakness and nausea, hypotension, fatigue, adrenal crisis, and severe pain. All sorts of issues: circulatory system collapse and kidney failure are all potentials with Addison's. Celiac disease is an issue where we've got antibodies being generated against gluten, and that ends up causing some reactions that we see within the small intestine as we get immune reactions to our diet, basically consuming wheat that's full of gluten, right? And it's really from that stuff. There are some other glutens that, as far as I know, aren't really as big of an issue. It's wheat that's the problem. So severe diarrhea and abdominal pain, anemia, and malnutrition may result, and a lot of the malnutrition is a result of the diarrhea and potential diet if you are still consuming some of that. It's interesting, all right? I'm going to give you one quick little story because I think it's interesting. It's also something that wasn't necessarily the nicest thing to do, all right? But interesting, all right? So, and you know, sometimes when you say, or someone says, oh, I have a friend, they're really talking about themselves, but this is not the case, all right? I'm not talking about myself, all right? So I have a friend, right? He in turn was pretty stinking sure he had celiac disease, right? He would consume stuff that had gluten and it would rip him apart, all right? Severe diarrhea, for sure, all right? And he was pretty sure that it was celiac disease that was getting him, all right? He changed his diet up. He was, you know, not consuming any of this stuff. He liked to imbibe in some beer, and they have some beers that are made that are gluten-free, and they're pretty expensive, right? So also an issue, right? I'm like, this is costly, right? These are problems, right? So he's eating weird stuff because he can't have any sort of gluten. His diet's different, all of these things, and he still, you know, kind of seems like he has some ill effects, right? So he's got a roommate that starts to think maybe this guy doesn't have celiac disease, right? Because it seems like he still gets some intestinal issues, even if he hasn't really been consuming that stuff, right? So that's his first observation that he makes and makes him start wondering a little bit. Now, let me back it up a bit, all right? This friend of mine that claims to have celiac disease developed a parasitic infection when he was younger, all right? He was, I don't know if he was like one of the guys that worked at the scout camp or if he was a Boy Scout at scout camp, but it was a scout camp situation, all right? I think he was working there all summer long. Oftentimes, Boy Scout camp type of stuff, you're there for a week. I think he was there the whole summer, all right? But that might be a little bit fuzzy. It doesn't matter, all right? As a youth, he gets this parasite called Giardia, which is nasty, and it gives you some bad diarrhea, all right? It typically takes about a month before you really start feeling the ill effects from this parasite, all right? And you get some nasty diarrhea, all right? So there are drugs you can take that combat the Giardia and really pretty effective in about 5 days or so. You can clear that infection and you're good to go, all right? But he didn't do that, all right? When he was treating the Giardia, and this maybe was his parents, I don't know, all right? But they had looked up some other things that you could maybe do without, because some of these parasitic drugs, you know, maybe they're pretty quick and effective, but they're also pretty toxic. And they can do some other damage to your body. And maybe, you know, I don't know exactly that right now off the top of my head, side effects from this, but maybe they had looked into some of it and they thought, you know, maybe we could do something different. Maybe we could look for more of a natural potential to try to combat this. So they altered his diet, is what they tried to do, to try to starve out the Giardia or something like that, right? So he had a very bland diet. He was eating a lot of rice and not whole lots of other complex things, not giving it all sorts of nutrients that maybe the Giardia really wanted, right? They take up residence in your intestines and just start absorbing all sorts of stuff, right? So by not giving it lots of nutrients, the thought was maybe they'll starve him to death, and not the kid, the Giardia, starve. What we're going to do to get rid of your parasites, just quit feeding it, right? That's not what they did, right? But he seemed, after they switched this up and whatever, he seemed like maybe he had recovered, all right? But flash forward years later, all right, the roommate starts wondering, maybe he never actually got rid of the Giardia in the first place, right? What if he's kept some of these guys and they've sort of become like the normal flora? He's had them for years and they're living in his intestines. And when he eats some things, he gets a flare up and gets some nasty diarrhea, and he blames it on the bland diet, that he wasn't consuming any wheat products. And then after he went off of that diet and reintroduced it, he starts seeing these ill effects and thought, self-diagnosed, that he had developed celiac disease from altering this stuff, because whenever he ate bread or any sort of stuff with gluten in it, he got diarrhea really bad. All right. Well, Giardia was super happy once that stuff got reintroduced. And so they just went to town. And that's really what was making him feel ill. All right. And I know that because the roommate decided to do a little test on him. All right. Which is something that really is probably not the best thing to do. All right. But had this guy actually had celiac disease, if he were to consume some stuff with gluten in it, he would have a serious reaction, all right? Because that's what happens with celiac disease. So he slipped him a little bit of gluten. He just put a little bit of flour in something that he was going to eat, and then he ate it, and nothing happened, all right? And then he did it to him again and gave him a little bit of gluten, and nothing happened. And that's when my buddy got pissed off, because the roommate's like, look, you don't have celiac disease. I've been feeding you gluten for, you know, the whole week, right? You've been eating this stuff and you haven't had any ill effects. You don't have celiac disease, right? And had I told you that I had given you some gluten, you'd probably be crapping yourself, because maybe it's a little bit in your head as well, right? You've already figured out that's what's doing it, right? So he doesn't tell him, he doesn't develop any issues. And in turn, he goes to the doctor thinking, maybe I still have Giardia. And so they give him the stuff to collect his feces. He collects it over the course of the day, takes it in there, and sure enough, he still has Giardia. They were able to detect some of the parasites in his feces. And now he's on this drug to treat the Giardia. And like I said, takes about a week, not with him, because it had been persisting in him for so long. He had, I believe it was 3 weeks worth of the treatment. But after that, no more Giardia, no more celiac disease, no more expensive frothy beverages. Gluten-free ones. I mean, he still probably likes tasty beverages, all right? But changed, right? And then he was thankful, right? But he was a little bit upset at first, because he's like, how could you do that to me, right? Which kind of makes sense, right? And deep down, had he had a, kind of nasty reaction, the roommate's like, well, I mean, he gets diarrhea, whatever. I mean, it's not like, it's not going to be the end of the world with him, right? So if I give him a little and he gets some diarrhea, well, then we'll say, well, he probably really does have celiac disease. He's like, I'll still test him one more time, right? You got to replicate it, right? Interesting, right? So that's my little sidebar tidbit of celiac. Kind of crazy, all right? My wife has a cousin who truly does have celiac disease. And when he was a little kid, he was kind of sickly. He had lots of issues and he'd eat stuff and would be ill and was really kind of small for his age. And a lot of it was malnutrition. They didn't realize what was really happening. And when he got first, second grade, somewhere right in there, that's when they actually recognized it. And his diet truly is altered and he seems all fine and good, but different, right? Definitely a different situation. All right, enough of that. So moving onward, diabetes, type 1 diabetes. This is an autoimmune situation where we've got T cells destroying, and this again, that type 4, the beta cells of your pancreas, the cells that are pumping out the insulin, helping to facilitate the entry of glucose into our cells. And without that being available, we get massive amounts of glucose that doesn't get brought in and metabolized as it should. So hyperglycemia is excessive amounts of sugar in your circulation. You've got extreme thirst and urination because your body's trying to dump all of that sugar. And you want to take in more water and rid yourself of that. All right. So people with type 1 diabetes, there's weight loss and fatigue. We typically think of these individuals being relatively slim. We flip it around and think about the type 2 diabetes, and that's different, all right? And that's diet-based, not immune cell-based. And it's an overactivity of that, and you get resistance to the insulin, different, all right? And it's the opposite, typically thinking overweight in those circumstances, right? This type 2 diabetes, back in the day was something that was described as adult onset. It was something that you thought about hitting you in middle age as you have, put on some pounds. And now type 2 diabetes is a little bit different when we think about that stuff. And it's plaguing children right as we think about this starting to hit little kids, because usually it takes some years before you start seeing these issues. And with obesity issues, type 2 diabetes is a problem across the board with all age groups now, which is truly pretty disturbing and makes you think, diet-based, there's definitely some issues with that. So Graves' disease, I know we got an image of this in just a second. We started that before I switched over. So this antibodies targeting the thyroid stimulating receptors on the thyroid gland. And now we see this hypothyroidism, irregular heartbeat, heat intolerance, weight loss, potential for goiter, and this exophthalmia, so kind of like bulging out eyes. I've got images of both of those here in just a second. Hashimoto thyroiditis. Here we could see cytotoxic T cells and other players targeting thyroid gland. And we can see similar issues with this Graves' disease, similar and some others. MS or multiple sclerosis, here we start targeting cytotoxic T cells targeting the myelin sheath, our nerves insulators around them, and that causes severe pain and potential paralysis, all sorts of potential issues that may result dependent upon the level of impact, and it is something that progresses. The myasthenia gravis, here we've got issues with the muscles with the acetylcholine receptors And so there's a lot of fatigue, muscle weakness, and ultimately lending to respiratory arrest. It's a fatal outcome with that. Psoriasis is infection when we start thinking the skin. So cytokines activating keratinocytes, and we see a lot of patches of skin that are sloughing off like excessively. So itchy, sore, thick, red, and multiple areas that we see impacted. Rheumatoid arthritis, autoantibodies, and immune complex that stimulates complement activity, and we see damage to joints and bones with this. And there are potentials with some of these complexes where our Streptococcus pyogenes may play a role in some of that, stimulating it. And that's back to those type 3s. And the lupus, the systemic lupus, autoantibodies against nuclear and cytoplasmic molecules. We see deposition of some of these complexes, immune complexes in tissues. So that goes back to that type 3 again, and seeing complement activity with that. So fatigue and fever, joint pain and swelling, potential for hair loss. There's oftentimes the characteristic sort of rash on your face that sort of looks butterfly-like. I think we've got a picture of that, and some issues with photosensitivity and other stuff. So this table definitely, I think, is good to describe some of these things. Let me stop that and go back to the PowerPoint. So truly just kind of a handful of images. I'm not going to go through lots of detail because I already kind of gave you those details. But here we can see with the Graves or Hashimoto, the goiter that is a potential, all right? This is the exophthalmia. I kind of wish we had a little bit of a profile so we could see them a little more bulging out. This looks like you just kind of scared the crap out of her, right? And she's like, ah! But we see this definitely as a characteristic with Graves. Here with the Addison's disease, we could see some hyperpigmentation. So the redness in the palms as one example with that. And remember, there's issues, fatigue, and other problems with that. With the Addison's disease and treatment with some of that was like different amphetamine treatment in some of these individuals, stimulants to in turn deal with the fatigue. And I've heard stories of Addison's. John F. Kennedy had Addison's disease. He dealt with lots of fatigue. And apparently there was a doctor that was one of his favorites, apparently, that had the potentials to make him feel much better. And in turn, it was injections of amphetamine that made him feel so much better. And this doctor became the doctor to the stars, because not only was he making JFK feel good, he was making all sorts of other people feel good as well. And in turn, they called him Dr. Feelgood, right? And Motley Crue's got a song talking about him, right? Who are you gonna call? Right? I said that before, and somebody pipes up and they're like, Ghostbusters. And I'm like, different, but yes, right? Could call them too. All right. It's different. All right. So here's the myasthenia gravis. This image, we technically saw a little of this, thinking tetanus and botulinum, not the same, but similar as we're looking at some of the acetylcholine and what's happening. So this is the normal situation where acetylcholine hits those receptors, and we can see normal muscle contractions. And then over here with the antibodies linking up to it, blocking their ability to dock up to these receptors and halting that. So we see the paralysis as a result of it. We can't do our normal contraction as we should. Here we've got an individual with the rheumatoid arthritis. I assume it's this guy's hands that we're looking at with the x-ray, but I don't know. Looks very painful to see that with it all contorted like that. And I'm assuming he's not just bending them like that. That's the way it is when you're just hanging out normal, relaxed, if you could call that relaxed, right? Probably not so much. So your ability to actually do stuff is dramatically impaired at this point, all right? Kind of crazy. Here, you can see the butterfly rash on the cartoon. You can kind of see it a little bit right here, all right? Sort of rosy cheeks going up over the bridge of the nose, both sides sort of butterfly-like, all right? And there are all sorts of issues with lupus where we can see, you know, skin manifestations, ulcers in the mouth, muscle aches. There's all sorts of problems where we can maybe see some heart involvement, circulation, things like that. Kidneys are also impacted, and we're not really seeing that, but we're almost, right? So lastly, you know, there are, and this, I could flip back to the book, but I'm not going to. There are other issues when we start thinking about like some immune disorders. And as we have just this one image, there are other things besides this when we think about some of these autoimmune disorders. This is a primary autoimmune disorder. This is something that you are born with, all right? And then we could think about other stuff like acquired autoimmune or acquired immune deficiencies like AIDS, the result of a viral infection that causes these problems. That's different than what we're thinking about here, all right? Some similarities with your immune system basically being destroyed or breaking down, the ability to recognize and respond to foreign invaders with all sorts of different types of immune situations are dramatically impacted when we think about it, all right? So SCID is severe combined immunodeficiency. Basically, you're born really without the ability to mount any sort of an immune response. So anything and everything really holds the potential to cause a fatal infection, right? Things that we come in contact with and never really recognize as a problem can be a huge problem, all right? Common cold that we may contract and we get better from and all fine and good could be something that is the demise of these individuals because they flat out can't mount any sort of response against these things, right? So David Vedder was known as the Bubble Boy. There's technically a couple movies about David. Older one that I believe John Travolta was in. I think he was maybe the father. I can't remember. And then there is a newer one talking about some of this. So crazy stuff. All right. David was born in the early 1970s and had this disorder, right? Where he can't mount any sort of a response. And basically, they kept him in a super sterile environment. He lived in a bubble, right? A plastic bubble that basically they kept everything inside of that nice and sterile. All of the stuff he had was in this bubble and sterilized, right? He didn't have much stuff in there in the first place, right? And his food was, very carefully prepared and, brought into this. There were little like glove things where you could put your hands in, you could hug him, but you couldn't actually hug him, right? No embrace from his parents because simply touching him could potentially kill him, all right? So they put him in here with the hopes that medicine will figure out a way to help him, to cure him. That's the thought. And he lived a little over a decade in this bubble. NASA built him a little space suit so he could get out of the bubble, but stay in his own bubble. All right. He's still in a bubble, right? But self-contained, right? So gave him the opportunity to do a little bit of stuff in his little space suit, all right? But still not really the same, all right? So he in turn decides, and I assume lots of counseling with him and his parents and talking with doctors. There's really no cure in sight. It just doesn't seem like the potential for him to really get any sort of help is there. So he decides that he's done and he crawls out of the bubble, embraces his family, and he gets sick and dies. All right. Sad story, truly sad story. All right. Couple of years after crawling out of the bubble, they figured out a way to deal with this stuff. That's also a sad story, right? So SCID was one of with gene therapy, and we mentioned some of this stuff way back last chunk of material. The littlest bit we talked about, all right, was some of these potentials, and SCID was one of them that we were able to manipulate with some gene therapy, manipulate some cells and cure a couple of kids of this disorder. And we also killed some, all right? And that's when really trying to cure stuff stopped and more of the therapy trying to treat instead of cure became more of the common idea. Can we deal with stuff? Maybe, right? Can we cure it? Maybe, but it's going to be a problem, all right? And we want it to not be a problem, right? So that's kind of where we're at with some of that. And there were a couple of other disorders that were also right in there. Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome is another situation that's an immune situation where your body can't mount as good of a response. It's not as severe as this, but still bad, all right? And there were a few that were able to be cured of those. But again, now it's more of a treatment where we can extract the patient's cells, we can manipulate them and put them back in, but we have to keep doing that because it's not something that we're targeting the stem cells in the individual so that all of the cells are correct every time from that point forth. That's where we had the problems, right? So handfuls of other ones besides this, and I know, and I'm not flipping it back to the text, but I know there's another table in there that goes through and talks about some of that. You don't need to get too bogged down with it. All right, that's the end of that. Questions, concerns? Your exam opens in 15 minutes. Yes, I know someone will be on there taking it at probably 10:01 because that's just how that stuff seems to happen. Part of me thinks you won't, you'll wait till Monday, right? But that's not the case with everybody. There's somebody just waiting, right? Right now, they're like, okay, 15 minutes, quick bathroom break, and then test. All right. Good luck, farewell. Have a great weekend. All of the disease starts on Monday. Good times. Yay, disease!